I'm really excited to introduce this section. What we're going to be talking about here is sort of the basic ethical analysis that we do all the time in offering drugs, approving drugs, developing drugs. It's the risk-benefit analysis. Ethicists do it, investigators do it, IRBs do it, data safety monitoring boards do it. The patients, we hope, do it, right? It's part of our informed consent is to make sure that they can do that. So we're going to speak about this risk-benefit analysis from all kinds of perspectives this morning for the next couple of hours. We're going to start with 3 perspectives from the FDA, and I'd like to introduce those 3 people to begin with. So there's Mark Theoret, who's the lead medical officer of the melanoma sarcoma team, and he's going to be speaking on the FDA perspective in general. Then we're going to hear from Gwynn Ison, and it's very interesting. She's going to be telling us about the workshop that was working on expanding eligibility, because as we all know that the eligibility in order to get good science has to be homogeneous, but now the question is how can we go about including some of those groups that are typically excluded. And finally, we're going to hear from Steve Lemery in the FDA, and Steve has been he's also a lead medical officer, and he's done a lot of work in expanded access, and we're going to hear from him about that. So did Mark make it? I heard he was held up. He didn't? So Gwen, do you want to lead off for us?
Sorry about that. I almost didn't make it either, but here I am. So thank you. Good morning. My name's Gwynn Ison, and as was noted, I'm a clinical reviewer at the FDA in the Office of Hematology and Oncology Products, and I've been involved with the ASCO FDA Friends of Cancer Research eligibility criteria project for over 2 years now, and I was asked to discuss the project today. I think Ed Kim was probably the first choice, but he was unable to make it, so I'm going to do my best to imitate him. I'm just kidding. So again, I'm a federal employee, so I have no financial disclosures to discuss, and I will not be discussing any off-label or investigational use of named products in my presentation. So it's important to first remind ourselves what the goals of clinical trials are or should be. The goal is to understand the risks and benefits of a therapy in a specific population or disease setting. It's also to facilitate our ability to generalize study findings and ideally to apply the findings to all patients with the disease or diseases studied. To that end, eligibility criteria are a key component of the design of a clinical trial. So the intended roles of eligibility criteria include defining the patients who may potentially be appropriate to receive an investigational therapy within the context of a given clinical trial. These criteria should ideally facilitate accrual to the trial and permit patient access to investigational agents as appropriate. The criteria are also in place to ensure the safety of patients treated on a trial, in most cases by limiting or prohibiting the enrollment of patients who may be too sick or otherwise not appropriate to receive an agent whose safety profile has not been adequately characterized. Finally, in an ideal scenario, eligibility criteria that will help to yield trial results that are generalizable to a broader U.S. population are desired and are directly in line with the FDA's mission. And so although we like to think that having many specific eligibility criteria will facilitate accrual to trials, the result is that there are barriers to clinical trial enrollment, and one of the barriers is utilization of excessive or overly rigid eligibility criteria. And so although a goal of the criteria may be to facilitate trial accrual, what has been described is that accrual rates of adult cancer patients to clinical trials in the US is exceedingly low. Only about 3 to 5% of adults with cancer will enroll into a clinical trial in this country. One of the reasons for this is the presence of excessive eligibility criteria due to there being many patients with the disease of interest who fall outside of these specific criteria defined within a protocol. Another disadvantage of too many eligibility criteria is that the result of having these overly rigid criteria is enrollment of perhaps a homogeneous population of patients. And then the result, again, is a lack of generalizability to the more heterogeneous group who are likely to receive a drug post-approval. So this has obvious risks, particularly with regard to safety, because the trial results and the drug label that comes from that may not provide adequate guidance to clinicians on how to deliver the therapy to the more heterogeneous population. So this brings us to the Modernizing Eligibility Criteria project, and this has been going on for several years and is being led by Ed Kim. This is a snapshot of the JCO article that was published back in 2015, and it serves sort of as a starting point, in a sense, for the project that is now underway. So shown here in this table, it's from the original article, and it provides the thought process to consider with regard to specific eligibility criteria in order to perhaps make a more informed decision at the level of an individual trial, and to determine whether some criteria could be done away with or modified, but to still be able to effectively and safely conduct the trial. So as has been talked about, the goal of modernizing eligibility has also been identified and included in the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. So what really are the goals for this project? They are to challenge assumptions in past practices which have become entrenched in some ways in designing clinical trials. So a goal is to try to create a new culture with new perceptions and attitudes when it comes to writing protocols and designing trials. This will likely involve creating new language to use in the protocols. To do this, it will necessitate active discussions with the FDA during the design phase of trials so that justifications can be clarified and agreements can be reached on the specifics of who to include and exclude from a specific trial. And although there will be publication of the recommendations on how to broaden the criteria, the aim will also be to go this step further and to actually implement these recommendations. So one piece of the puzzle to address this problem has been this ongoing effort, but we had been planning a workshop starting about over a year ago, and it occurred in May of 2016. The groups involved included the FDA, ASCO, Friends of Cancer Research, NCI, and clinical investigators from multiple institutions around the country, as well as industry representatives and patient advocacy groups. So the workshop was the culmination of efforts of 4 working groups that were defined as being potential areas within the topic of eligibility criteria that could be addressed for specific ways in which they could potentially be relaxed or even done away with in clinical trial protocols going forward. These 4 criteria, which really are by no means the only ones that are important or could have been chosen, but they were the ones that were chosen, were the inclusion of patients with HIV, patients with brain metastases, pediatric patients, and patients with baseline organ dysfunction, including liver, kidney, and cardiac dysfunction. Later, patients with prior malignancies were also added to that last group. Although the workshop, again, has occurred, our efforts are still ongoing, and we are working to now provide guidance on what the working groups have recommended. So shown here again are some of the members of the working groups and the main committees, and in the next few slides I'll go over some of the recommendations of the specific groups. So first, the brain metastases group. Shown here is just sort of the high-level key recommendations from the group. The group basically divided patients with brain metastases into 3 subgroups because they felt that the recommendations differed for each of these groups on the basis of clinical course, prognosis, and safety. So the first group would be patients with treated or stable brain metastases. And the recommendation is basically that these patients should really be included in all phases of clinical trials unless there is a compelling safety reason for exclusion. The second group is patients with newly diagnosed active and or progressive brain mets, and the panel agreed that this is obviously a more difficult group to make a blanket recommendation about, or a one-size-fits-all recommendation. However, they will still likely recommend that it still may be appropriate to include these patients in most trials based upon factors related to the specific cancer and agent under investigation, and they will give sort of more details about potentially how to do that. Finally, the third group would be patients with leptomeningeal disease, and the working group recommended that in most trials, these patients, it's still really appropriate probably to exclude these patients because of their very poor prognosis. So the next group was the HIV or AIDS working group, and the recommendations from this group, similar to the brain metastases group, were broken down into several subgroups for more granular recommendations. But the overarching recommendation will be that HIV patients should be included in all phases of trials, again, unless there is a reason to believe that the drug under investigation may somehow interfere with the control of the HIV infection. And this may or may not be easy to discern depending on the phase of development. HIV-related eligibility criteria should focus on current and past CD4 and T cell counts, a patient's history of AIDS-defining conditions, such as opportunistic infections, as well as the status of a patient's HIV antiretroviral therapy, including how long they've been on a current regimen, et cetera. Patients with healthy HIV disease based on these factors, as well as some others, which I won't go into, but they will be included in the recommendation. These patients really should be treated with the same standards as patients without HIV with the same type of cancer. So the thinking is to treat the HIV as really a comorbidity, antiretroviral medications being viewed as a concomitant medication, just as with heart disease or diabetes. The next group was the minimum age working group, or the pediatric group, and they focused on how the minimum age for trial eligibility could be lowered below what is sort of the 18 years is kind of the traditional used in trials enrolling adults. The 2 places where the group felt most strongly about challenging the automatic exclusion of pediatric patients will be first in initial dose-finding trials, which generally include a variety of cancer diagnoses. And so the thinking is that these trials could easily include a pediatric-specific cohort, especially if there is scientific rationale, such as data on a molecular pathway or the histology of the tumor. In later phase trials in diseases that potentially span adult and pediatric populations, such as sarcomas, trials should include pediatric patients with those tumors as well. And at the very least, the age limit for inclusion of patients which might otherwise only, trials that might otherwise only enroll adults should at least be lowered to 12 years of age, below the standard 18. And then finally, the last group was sort of the most diverse group of a set of criteria to address, and this was the organ dysfunction, comorbidities, and prior malignancies group. So I'll say a little bit about each in the next few slides. So with regard to the organs dysfunction, renal dysfunction, the recommendation should be for patients, the main thing is that the renal function should be determined based on creatinine clearance rather than serum creatinine. Liberal criteria for creatinine clearance should be used, particularly if renal excretion is not thought to be a significant component of the drug's pharmacokinetics. In general, the group will actually not make many recommendations on changing the current criteria for underlying hepatic or cardiac dysfunction. However, there will be continued encouragement to design subsequent studies or include specific cohorts for these patients in these categories. There also will be recommendations to encourage and increase enrollment of geriatric patients into clinical trials. With regard to patients with prior malignancies, the recommendation will be to liberalize the timeframes that are currently used for most trials, whether it be a malignancy within 5 years or whatever, as well as recommending that patients with certain concomitant cancers that are not life-threatening, such as non-melanoma skin cancer, just for instance, but we will recommend others, these should also be included. And so what are the next steps for this project? We're aiming to publish the working group recommendations, hopefully in early next year. We will promote implementation of the recommendations by creating standard language, which is inclusive and could potentially be used in protocols. We will encourage sponsors to routinely implement the recommendations, and we will work to try to track the progress on implementation in the community and document when and where the recommendations are being used or are not being used. We will need to obviously address practical issues and barriers as they arise. As I mentioned, there were other eligibility criteria that were also thought to be amenable to change, but did not have specific working groups for them. But we would still potentially down the road like to examine these, and these include criteria relating to drug washout periods, concomitant medications, and other factors that may lead to exclusion of elderly patients. And so an example of an ongoing trial with very broad eligibility criteria is the first trial being conducted by ASCO, which Dr. Shilsky can probably comment on better than me, but the TAPER study, or Targeted Agent and Profiling Utilization Registry Study. It's a phase 2 study with FDA-approved agents, but the agents are being used in unapproved cancer indications. And so the goal is to evaluate efficacy of the various targeted therapies, those which target specific molecular mutations, but in tumors for which the drug is currently not FDA approved. So the trial protocol has unique and very broad eligibility criteria, which are in line with what some of the recommendations will be from these working groups. In particular, there are no exclusions for patients with prior malignancies. Patients with HIV are generally included unless an individual clinician sees that there's a reason for exclusion. And likewise, patients with performance status of 2 are generally accepted with some exceptions depending on agents. Likewise, patients with brain metastases in this trial have fewer caveats that would otherwise limit participation. So there will potentially be inclusion of more brain metastases patients on this study. Organ function requirements are still somewhat standard, but there will also be an upcoming amendment to lower the age limit so that patients may be as young as 12 to be enrolled in certain situations. And so given what has been laid out in terms of recommendations, where do we hope to be in, say, 5 years with this? Will we have begun to see these changes in protocols and perceptions? Will trials really be enrolling some of these patients? Will industry be embracing these recommendations and be implementing broader eligibility in their trial designs? Will young investigators or even older investigators be writing protocols with broader eligibility? And from my perspective, will the FDA be approving drugs in some of these populations, and or will there be labeling that may be able to guide investigators on how to administer drugs to some of these unique populations? And my answer is we hope so. And so my acknowledgments in reference of that.